Hello everyone, and welcome back to Empower the Votes video series. I'm Marshall Garvey, book author and social media consultant for history specialists, and today I want to talk about a subject that's often discussed with regards to electoral politics, but whose history is not always as well known, the issue of special interests. Now, the issue of corrosive special interest influence in U.S. politics is one that has permeated discourse for centuries, with manifestations that stretch across the expanse of the political spectrum. From William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Iron speech to Donald Trump promising to drain the swamp, promises to rid the federal government of the evils of corporate bribery and the politicians perpetually beholden to it have long been a popular way of connecting with voters. Given how long it's been an issue, the influence of special interests is one that has an extensive, albeit shifting, history over the past 2 centuries. The need to curb the power of special interest groups was one that was presciently recognized by the Founding Fathers. They were very wary of the rise of political parties, which they referred to then as factions. Part of why the United States Constitution had such a limited number of explicitly stated powers for Congress was to prevent it from allocating funds for special interests. This is a stark contrast to the norm of major politicians routinely being in the pockets of corporate interests today, whereas at the time, founding candidates like George Washington didn't practice fundraising at all. Soliciting contributions from others would have betrayed their unspoken ethos of not wanting to seek the highest office out of ambition, but rather solely for the well-being of the general public. Not only were candidates in the nation decades of the American Republic self-funded, it was they who sought favors from voters, not the other way around. An especially particular tactic was to offer whiskey in exchange for votes, embraced by Washington in particular. Fundraising didn't really emerge as a concept in presidential campaigning until 1828 with Andrew Jackson. This was all the more appropriate as this period marked the ascendance of the second party system, including Jackson's Democratic Party, which still operates today. Old Hickory considered the government to be a stagnant system, controlled by elite insiders who had no concern for the common man. It is deathly ironic that it was Jackson who effectively commenced the era of special interests by introducing patronage. More colloquially known as the spoils system, it rewarded loyal political supporters of Jackson with plump federal positions. Jackson defended it as a bulwark against corruption that made government more efficient, as it led to a rotation of workers and administrators that ostensibly wouldn't become career politicians. Of course, that wasn't the case at all. The inherent favoritism and partisanship that decided who got federal jobs, plus the fact that they weren't handed out on the basis of merit, guaranteed that corruption would happen. Many began to believe that patronage created a self-serving and incompetent form of government. This line of thinking was vindicated by the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant from 1869 to 1877. Grant's patronage led to one of the most corrupt cabinets in U.S. history, rocked by an array of scandals ranging from a gold speculation ring to collusion with whiskey distillers to help them avoid federal taxation. The former Civil War general's reliance on trusting military advisors with key roles, as well as rampant nepotism, made it clear more than ever that patronage needed to be addressed at the federal level. It was a clear threat to the integrity of American democracy. While there were some attempts at curbing patronage federally during this time, it wasn't until a presidential assassination in 1881 that the issue finally came to a head. Charles Guiteau, a Republican Party official who felt he played an outsized role in getting James Garfield elected president the prior year, was incensed when he wasn't offered a key diplomatic position. Enraged, he shot Garfield, who died shortly thereafter from an infection from the bullet wound. 2 years later, Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur, defied his reputation as a machine politician by signing the Pendleton Act. The new law banned federal positions from going to individuals with clear party affiliations or financial ties to the candidate. Jobs were to be issued on merit alone. While patronage would persist in municipal governments for decades, from Tammany Hall to Mayor Daley's Chicago, it was effectively done at the federal level after decades of debate. However, the scourge of special interest money would take on a new and much more familiar form the following decade in 1896. The presidential race between Republican William McKinley and Democrat William Jennings Bryan served as a microcosm for clashing interests in the Gilded Age. Bryan was an avowed populist who criticized big business like railroads, finance, and industrial companies, as well as the monopolies and trusts they formed to maximize profits. In front of enthused crowds throughout his 18,000-mile campaign speaking tour, he promised to jail the plutocrats and institute fair economic policies. It was a message that resonated with many in the apogee of the Gilded Age, a time of rapid economic and industrial expansion in the United States. While leading to unprecedented wage and GDP growth, it also concentrated enormous wealth in the hands of a veritable aristocracy, while many citizens lived in poverty. Unsurprisingly, Bryan has often been compared to Bernie Sanders, the politician whose economic policies and rousing speeches have struck a nerve in the recent surge of economic inequality. The Republicans, meanwhile, countered the Bryan nomination with Ohio Governor William McKinley, a portly establishment politician whose relationship with big business was more than friendly. However, after the nominating conventions, it was Bryan who appeared to have outsized momentum. The fiery populist undertook the first traveling campaign in the nation's history, traveling 18,000 miles across the country in a whistle-stop railroad tour. In some 600 speeches to around 5 million enraptured listeners, he drilled his message home with great resonance. The titans of industry were terrified that Bryan would win and threaten their monopolistic economic power. They invested heavily in McKinley, whose campaign was run by Cleveland businessman Mark Hanna. Hanna was not only highly connected to big business, but unapologetically believed the government served only to protect it. There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is, he once famously said. Hanna immediately began soliciting contributions from Wall Street bankers, convincing them that the specter of socialism and anarchy was imminent if Bryan won. Consequently, copious amounts of corporate cash were donated to the McKinley campaign. A lot of it came from three of the titans of industry that shaped the era: banker J.P. Morgan, steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, and oil baron John D. Rockefeller. Their individual donations of $250,000, roughly $7.2 million in today's money, were part of a $16 million total. To say this level of spending to get McKinley elected was unprecedented is an understatement. It equated to almost 0.06% of GDP that year. More importantly, it worked, funding a propaganda campaign of pamphlets and speakers with a reach large enough to counter Bryan. While the popular vote on Election Day was close, McKinley prevailed with a hefty margin in the Electoral College. However, there was a backlash to this new entrenchment of corporate money in politics. In its most violent form, President McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by an anarchist who was enraged by the continued disparity between rich and poor in the United States. He was succeeded by the unabashedly progressive Teddy Roosevelt, then the youngest president in American history, who undertook an ambitious platform of corporate trust-busting and likewise initiatives. Unsurprisingly, he was receptive to the growing movement to curb special interest spending in elections, giving a speech in 1905 to Congress that called for a federal ban on corporate contributions to federal campaigns. 2 years later, he signed the Tillman Act into law, which explicitly banned corporations and national banks from contributing money to federal campaigns. For the rest of the 20th century, the issue of campaign finance reform was furthered by additional laws and regulations. Some were implemented in response to major scandals, the most important being the creation of the Federal Election Commission, FEC, after the rampant campaign finance abuses that shaped the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s. At least in comparison to the exorbitant contributions in 1896, special interest spending throughout the 20th century was relatively held in check, rarely exceeding 0.01% of American gross domestic product. Of course, there were instances of brazen attempts at influence by different companies and industries. In 1972, ITT pledged $400,000 for the Republican National Convention in the hopes of getting President Richard Nixon to help them avoid antitrust suits. The 1996 presidential contest saw the most powerful lobby of the era, tobacco, spend almost $11 million total. At a time when anti-tobacco advocates were seeking to inform the public about the substance's danger to their health, Such an effort to sway an election was especially salient. With the resurgence of corporate power towards the end of the 20th century, campaign finance reached its greatest legislative moment in a timely manner in 2002 with the McCain-Feingold Act. The most comprehensive legislation on the issue yet, it tethered donations to inflation, required disclosure of contributions, and put restrictions on advertising. One key component was requiring candidates to endorse every single advertisement, which kept secret groups from running ads without authorization. In January 2010, the power of special interest spending received an unprecedented boost in the highly controversial Citizens United versus FEC ruling. The United States Supreme Court declared that the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment prohibits the federal government from limiting financial expenditures by corporations and other groups on election communications, chiefly advertisements. Coming just 2 years after the Great Recession, many saw the ruling as the christening of a second Gilded Age, marked by a level of income inequality and corporate largesse similar to that of the 1890s. Indeed, it was a ruling whose effects quickly became clear in subsequent elections. Just 2 years after it was decided by the Supreme Court, the 2012 presidential contest became the most expensive one in United States history. Outside groups spent a staggering $970 million in total, with President Barack Obama and challenger Mitt Romney's campaign budgets both well above $800 million each. The most prominent of the emboldened billionaire donor class were the Koch brothers, whose company, Koch Industries, chipped in some $2.2 million, almost all for Republican candidates such as Romney. The 2012 cycle also displayed a troubling new form of special interest spending in dark money. Most donors and fundraising groups, even the most lavish ones, are required to report their identity to the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC. However, political nonprofits and limited liability corporations aren't legally required to disclose their donors, thus allowing them to spend in secrecy as they wish. They also changed the nature of advertising, financing attack ads that no longer legally required the approval of the candidates they backed. Throughout the election, they spent around $300 million across both parties, a gaudy practice that was emboldened by the Citizens United ruling. Noted for its seemingly unparalleled divisiveness and intensity, the 2016 election was appropriately even more expensive. Just as Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan veritably bought the 1896 election 120 years prior, a small cadre of powerful millionaires made their voices heard with record-setting donations. Casino magnate Sheldon Adelson cemented his reputation as the go-to money source for Republican candidates, doling out a staggering $123,234,400. On the Democratic side, investor and philanthropist George Soros donated over $20 million. Adding in money spent by the campaigns themselves, the cumulative price tag was upwards of $6.6 billion, $86.5 million more than in 2012. Campaign spending as a fraction of GDP was almost 0.03%, the highest since the robber barons set the record for expenditure in 1896. As the 2020 election rapidly approaches, the outsized influence of special interests clearly stands as one of the biggest challenges voters face. It's one that's deeply prevalent in both major parties, who have become clearly beholden not only to corporations, but powerful individuals like the Kochs, Adelson, Soros, and the Walton family. While it has been an omnipresent one in some form or another since the mid-19th century, the evolution in its ability to impact elections is complex. In the first 3 decades of U.S. electoral proceedings, special interests not only didn't really exist, but were virtually unthinkable. Its initial and most direct manifestation in the spoils system has long been consigned to history. However, the Citizens United ruling in 2010 and the resultant high expenditure in 2012 and 2016 feels less like an evolution and more like history repeating itself, as the old saying goes. Just like in 1896, the lack of strong campaign finance laws, gaping income inequality, recent economic downturn, and growing corporate power have created a perfect storm that allows special interests to dominate election spending like never before. Mega donors can wield their influence in secrecy via dark money, unlike the brash candor Mark Hanna displayed in defending money in politics when William McKinley won. The landscape of special interest influence today would be unrecognizable to politicians and citizens of the burgeoning United States, not just because of the diversity of industries and the unfathomable amounts of money that pour in, but the chilling secrecy with which it now sloshes around each election cycle. Even in the time of COVID, the corruption of special interests holds sway over Washington. This has been evident in the limited federal relief efforts for U.S. citizens, with far more money going to corporations and special interests than to everyday citizens struggling to get by as a result of the COVID induced recession. At a time of jarring tectonic shifts with regards to public health, climate change, and institutional racism, keeping track of influence on campaigns is harder than ever. It was challenging enough to keep tabs on the influx of money in election cycles throughout the past 10 years. Nevertheless, at a time when challenges to injustice are taking their greatest hold in half a century, curbing special interests and corrupt money shouldn't be seen as impossible. Especially with the growth in voter advocacy, including registration and fighting voter suppression, it is only fitting that new, greater forms of campaign finance reform follow suit. With a judicious understanding of history and uncompromising integrity in the present, we can certainly accomplish it. Thank you, everyone. I'm Marshall Garvey with History Specialists, and I'll see you next time.